Hi, everyone. Welcome to our live interview today, and thank you for joining us. It's great to see leaders tuning in from across regions, sectors, and disciplines. My name is Bhuva Shakti. I'm the Chief Ethics and Culture Officer at Women in AI, and I'm really glad to be joined today by Manail Anis Ahmed, Educator, Convenor, and Curriculum Innovator for AI and Emerging Technologies. Women in AI is a global nonprofit working to advance inclusive leadership, responsible innovation, and ethical governance in artificial intelligence. We are a team of volunteers spread across 170 plus countries, and I cannot do what I do without my team's support every single day. In my role as the Chief Ethics and Culture Officer at Women in AI, I focus on the intersection of ethics, culture, and leadership accountability globally across every country we operate. Much of my work centers on helping corporations and C suite leaders navigate AI transformation, even when AI is not their core business, and supporting startups in embedding governance, risk, and compliance early so AI readiness is built in from the start. I see firsthand how ethical AI decisions are shaped as much by culture and judgment as by technology. I'm delighted to be joined today by Manail, responsible AI lecturer at Columbia University in New York. She's an AI, emerging technology, and society expert specialized in facilitating engagement around these issues among classrooms, communities, and government, business, and technology leaders. She's an adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University, teaching and developing curricula across biotech entrepreneurship, bioinformatics, and drug discovery. Manail has formerly been visiting lecturer teaching percepts of technology, AI, and engineering ethics at Princeton University and has served as responsible AI mentor to graduate students through the Princeton Grad Futures program. At the World Economic Forum, Manail is a member of the Inclusive AI Workstream of the AI Governance Alliance. I titled our conversation today as Responsible AI, Policy, Culture, and Ethics in Practice. As AI continues to scale across sectors, another challenge is becoming increasingly clear. How do we move from defining responsible AI to actually implementing it? Frameworks are evolving, policies are being introduced, and ethical principles are widely discussed, yet the gap between intent and execution remains significant. Today's discussion is about understanding that gap and what it takes to translate research, policy, and ethics into real world systems that are accountable, context aware, and effective in practice. Let's get started. Hi, Manail. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. We often talk about responsible AI in terms of principles, but where do you see the biggest disconnect between principles on paper and what actually gets implemented on the ground?
Yeah, fantastic question to start with. Look, this is such a new technology, right? In the larger scheme of
Mhm.
things. I know that many of us have been working with a version of AI, perhaps not generative, perhaps just automation driven. Um, but we have not yet had a chance to define what principles need to be translated into practice. It's a technology that we've kind of been thrown into headlong, especially those who are non-technologists and have now got access to generative AI technologies. So in order for us to really think about where principles are missing in practice, we're going to have to take a huge step back and survey the ecosystem of technology adoption and think about where we have precedents for when we were dealing with new technologies and how um, countries, communities, corporations, society, and sectors such as education, healthcare, etc., um, what they determined to be important principles in adopting the technology. Sorry, that's a non-answer answer, but that's how broadly we need to look at things.
Yeah, no, that's perfect because at some point technology was for technologists, but today almost every single person has access to AI in some shape or form. Obviously, there are digital divides and so on and so forth. So, taking a step back to broadly look at it so we can define better for the future is a much better way than to just keep doing tactically day-to-day things and then figure out there is a bigger problem, right?
Yeah.
So, well said on that. Now, in your research, what does responsible AI in practice look like? Because there are so many definitions out there. It's industry specific, country specific, in fact, context and culture specific. So, what does happen when decisions have to be made under real constraints? Meaning, defining it on paper is different, but when you have time, cost, performance, information, that's really a constraint. How do you make it happen?
Yeah, look, once again, I'm going to broaden the canvas that we're painting on here, right? When we start talking about responsible AI, the conversation immediately goes to deployment within for-profit organizations. And I
Yeah.
think that we need to take a much larger view, right? It's not, I'm not imagining a company that acquires and deploys AI tools and what it should do with them. I'm taking a broader civilizational view. So AI is one of those technologies that causes social transformation and what I like to call techno-social change. How can it be responsible? It can be responsible by considering that it is not yet available to everyone around the world. So, first of all, the benefits are not accrued uniformly. It can be responsible by recognizing that there's a great deal of resource usage that's baked into the technology, and therefore areas of the world that are not resource rich or at least resource sufficient will not be able to benefit from the technology because they simply don't have those resources. It's a technology that builds on literacy and awareness about other technologies. So, for parts of the world where there is a triple digital divide, which means lack of access to technology, lack of awareness about how to use the technology, and the lack of accruing benefits from the technology, for those parts of the world, this is not something that's relevant at all. So, once again, we're leaving out a vast swath of the world that simply does not see AI or does not see it in a way that perhaps governments and policymakers would like for them to see it. We take a very Western centric, very industrialized approach to AI. And frankly, these conversations are tiresome because they're not looking at uh, it within the broader sweep and scope of things. So, the first thing I want to say about responsible AI is it's only as responsible as it is inclusive in a global environment. Currently, it's not very inclusive at all. We're using it in narrow ways to drive productivity, optimize, create efficiencies, drive financial and commercial growth. We're not using it in all the ways that we could be using it to perhaps equitably distribute the benefits of the technology. So, responsible AI usage, once again, very broad sweep.
Yeah, no, definitely. So it's not AI transformation anymore, you rightly said, and I've heard it a few times over the past few months from so many experts. It's more a social transformation that we are seeing at the moment, and trying not to be culture sensitive, context sensitive, and being aware of your local communities, global communities is not going to be a responsible approach, regardless of AI transformation that you may pursue, right? Now, how do ideas from academic research actually make their way into policy and industry systems? I mean, where does that pipeline tend to break down typically?
Yeah, I'm glad you prefaced that by saying that the pipeline tends to break down because indeed it does, right? Now,
Mm,
one of the things that a lot of people have complained about is how pipelines from research and knowledge production and dissemination, which is, education and knowledge farms, how the benefits of those systems are no longer trickling down to the communities that need them most. So the first thing that we're dealing with is a structural problem with education and research and the way it's structured. Um, The second thing we're dealing with is the capacity and the capability of governments and policymakers to be able to create a pipeline, an effective pipeline, where they can start learning from the best and brightest in respective fields, right? That's not a pipeline that's very robust, especially since, at least in the United States and certainly in many other parts of the world, there's a rise of populism and a breakdown of the linkages between policy and academia. So
Yeah.
it's becoming a very cultish sort of cult of personality, political culture in many countries, right? You can look at the US, you can look at India, you can look at Hungary until recently. Um, many countries are driven by the vision of one person, usually an older man who has not lived through the technological transformations that are impacting the rest of us, at least not come of age through these transformations. And so with this kind of cultish style of government, there is an effective breakdown of communication between the corridors of power and the places where new knowledge is produced. That's the first place we need to begin with, right? The second and more complicating question is, as I mentioned before, this is a technology that has left vast swaths of the population behind, which means that knowledge about this technology and further insight into how it should best be adapted for a more humane society is scarce, and it's only coming from certain quarters. Those quarters are even more isolated from the corridors of power, right? They have the luxury, these are well-funded universities and research institutions, and they have the luxury of closing in on themselves and talking only amongst each other. They have no real interest in having their voices heard by decision makers. They're
Mm.
happy kind of doing this on their own. And we can argue, there's a historical precedent. Um, we have peer-reviewed research as the monster to blame in this case, because in fact, research is only awarded if it's recognized by other people in the research community. That's just how it's been formalized in Western academia. So
Yeah.
you see what I'm saying? There's these little silos, these little kind of black boxes that don't speak to each other, and therefore there's no conversations across policy and academia, or perhaps very scarce ones. And those conversations take place in an echo chamber where people kind of agree with each other. The companies that produce the technology fund the research that goes to the governments that these companies are also lobbying to protect themselves against regulation. It's a very closed loop, and so the pipeline, I'm afraid, is not only broken down. I'm not sure that at this point that we have one to speak of.
Yeah. I mean, it's everywhere in all parts of the world. And I don't think it's only in the AI space. It has been traditionally happening with or without AI. The pipeline has been broken for some time. There are pockets of work, like you mentioned also. If we don't consider some of these ethical and cultural principles, then probably we are doing a disservice to the next generation, regardless of the past generation or the current generation that may or may not have seen such transformation in their lives, right? So, where do you see examples where policy frameworks for AI looked strong on paper but failed in real world application? Any examples that come to your mind, and why do you think that happened?
Yeah, so something that I've come across that I've been watching with great interest is the UNESCO recommendations or principles on AI ethics, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
or anything that's produced by the International Telecommunications Union. They're an agency within the United Nations that take a forward-looking approach to technology, socially inclusive, globally aware, contextualized approach, which is quite rare. The problem with pronouncements emanating from anything related to the United Nations is that we're living through a changing global order. And the United
Mm.
Nations has, for all intents and purposes, lost its legitimacy, right? It hasn't lost its legitimacy because it doesn't deal well with AI. It's lost its legitimacy because it hasn't been able to combat the forces of global political violence that have so strongly come to the fore in the last few years. The United Nations has become an organization that is toothless and voiceless in the face of this mass-scale military aggression in various parts of the world. And so when
Yeah.
it becomes something that stops being acknowledged for its basic purpose, which is, coordination among nations and most importantly, the propagation of peace and the avoidance of war, when it becomes a body that is not able to effectively have a say in those matters, then whatever it says about artificial intelligence is really besides the point, right? So
Yeah.
again, I will acknowledge that they've done some good work. But they're working in and among themselves, right? There's these wonderful conferences. Everyone knows each other. There's nice venues and nice locations around the world, and people have lovely discussions. But how effective is it actually in impacting um, the development and the direction of this technology? I'm not sure.
I mean, so rightly said. And you've been at the World Economic Forum, United Nations, and so many conferences. I always feel like we go there with so much energy, talk about it, learn more about it, and see what can be done. But when we all disperse, it feels like we are meeting back again the next year or at the next conference. But so little change has happened in between for the reason that the silos that you mentioned, right?
Yeah, and
Now,
I don't mean to take an activist approach to this, but what I'm trying to make clear is that in my mind, the entire ecosystem is misdirected. So, perhaps a more hopeful question that I could answer, just to make clear that I'm not an AI pessimist, I'm not a technology pessimist, um, is that where I see real hope and determination for solving these wicked global problems is at the level of undergraduate students. So,
mm,
technologists in training, young people who are coming of age in today's environment, who understand that we're living through a climate crisis, water bankruptcy, democratic backsliding, a sort of regression of the rights of women around the world. Young people who are coming of age in this climate understand in their bones what the problems in society are. So, with a little bit of encouragement, when they are asked to build technology that is future ready, I think they have a much clearer and sharper view of things. And this is a view that I think is what can become effective at the policy level in the future. And I'm not talking the far future, I'm talking the near future. The problem is that we're really so focused on the dinosaurs at the policy level that we're not looking at where the minds are being developed that are being fed into the big tech machine. And that's where I think we need to shift our focus to.
I couldn't agree more. I teach undergrad students as well and graduate students. You will see that undergrad students are so receptive, but also they challenge the social norms to be more ethical and responsive. So I've seen that happen. Now, coming from academia and policy background, I want to take a quick look at the organizations, right? Be it regional organizations, multinational corporations. Within these organizations, who do you think is responsible for translating ethical research into operational decisions? I mean, where does accountability currently fall short? What can we do? Because some of these corporations are responsible to run many parts of our day to day lives today, right? So, how do we ensure some of this translate into operationals?
Yeah, so I'm afraid that's another big sweeping question, right? Because I see us in a living through a time of polycrisis, and I don't think that this is a bad thing. I think that when systems outlive their utility, they are
Mm,
forced to evolve, and one of the things that happens during this transformation is a lot of old systems break and are swept aside, and new mechanisms and systems are forced to come into play. So after an unprecedented kind of 80 to 100-year period of stability, depending on how you want to look at it, post World War I or post World War II, I think we're at a point where we're ready for systemic transformation. And so one of the things that needs to happen is that pre-existing institutions, which, as I mentioned before, are losing their legitimacy and fading within the global order, need to be either refreshed or replaced by current institutions which reflect better the balance of power today. What do I mean by that? Post the World Wars, we needed a global multilateral body that was able to ensure human development across the globe for the countries that were resource rich and in a position to make decisions for the rest of us. Obviously, that time is long gone. That hierarchy of nations has evolved slowly but surely. Resources have been redistributed, or in many instances, found anew, created in other parts of the world. And so, why are we sort of clinging to the hope that these institutions that were created for a very different time would be able to serve us at the current time, right? That's the first flaw in our thinking. And I understand that that's very distressing, because what I'm indicating is that we need to change everything. But in fact, if we don't take an active approach to changing everything, if we don't acknowledge that everything needs changing, it'll change on its own anyway, and we will be left behind kind of wondering what to do, right? So my appeal to everyone listening is, get on this bandwagon of transformation. Start thinking about change as not a bad thing, as a transformative thing, as a progressive thing, and start adding your voice and your perspective to how this change could be maneuvered better. Because currently, if you think about any regional, a transnational, multilateral organization, whatever pronouncements they issue are really not going anywhere. I don't see a strong connection between any AI producing tech company and any multilateral organization, right? They work in
Yeah,
different universes, and they don't
totally disjoint.
totally disjointed. Absolutely. So what are the organizations that are bringing into consideration the fact that the United States, one of the largest economies in the world, is now being led, at least in the capital markets, by 5 behemoth tech companies? There is no body that acknowledges this. And the insistence is still that we should rein in big tech, or that we should regulate big tech, without really trying to create a connection to big tech or understanding big tech. I mean, this is the equivalent of, the network of railroads that were being laid in the United States in the 1920s, and decision makers saying, we're not going to engage with the people who are laying the rail networks. Well, what would that get them, right? They needed to
Yeah.
acknowledge and join this transformational um, space, and so that's the best analogy that I can come up with for today also.
Yeah, no, that's perfect because sometimes, there are policies, they aim for alignment across regions, and considering multilateral organizations, policy institutions, research, academia, and big tech, they're all doing their own thing, like we spoke about, disjointed. But many times when you see implementation is local, right? I lead the ethics and culture office at Women in AI. Many times people ask me, why do you need culture along with ethics? Because we've also spoken quite a lot about this. It's really important to be more culture sensitive, context sensitive to the local communities, right? So, how do you reconcile global AI frameworks with cultural and regulatory differences on the ground, anywhere in the world?
Sure. So I'll talk about the context that I currently operate in and I know best. Um, in my work as a responsible AI expert, I engage a great deal with engineering firms and with biotechnology firms. And
Mm,
my observation is that only the firms that have leaders that are culturally and contextually aware are the firms that are actually adapting the technology in a responsible as well as an effective way. And why do I put these two things together? It's because if you don't adapt the technology in a responsible way, ultimately somewhere down the line it leads to revenue loss. It leads to a
Correct. Yeah.
point where, there are some what they call unintended consequences. Something goes wrong. It's either a PR disaster or it's a loss of profitability in some way or another. In either scenario, people start dropping their allegiance to the company or the product in question. And it's not like they don't have alternatives, right? I mean, most
Yeah.
sectors are not like the tech sector. So the engineering sector, the biopharma sector, the bioengineering sector, these are all sectors where there's a plethora of firms with a great deal of excellent research happening. And so if if a certain paying client is not happy with the way AI is deployed in a certain organization, they have plenty of opportunities to make a change and go with someone else. So if firms like these are not being responsible in their AI deployment, they find that their bottom line suffers. So the effectiveness of the firm overall goes down, right? The other thing that I think firms across sectors are not yet looking at, and there's some research by the National Bureau of Economic Research. They came up with something a couple of years ago. Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, was one of the co-authors, or rather co-sponsors of this report. Daron Ajamolu, the economist from MIT, who calls AI a so-so technology, has been doing research based on, whatever evidence is available of the economic impact of AI.
Yeah.
None of these well-respected researchers or institutions are of the opinion yet that the economic impact of AI is something so staggering as to justify the investment in the speculation for AI, right? So
Mm.
what does this mean at the firm level? What this means is that firms are investing a lot more money in AI, hoping that they will get some as yet unknown returns, right? And the way this is being positioned is twofold. One is we're going to cut headcount because AI automates a lot of our processes. So
Big mistake.
right, and that's a human welfare angle, which it's not fashionable to talk about. People are losing livelihoods, right? Nobody wants to hear
Yeah.
that, because that means that you're a technology pessimist, which I certainly am not. So let me not make that my primary argument, that people are losing their livelihoods, even though in fact that should be the primary argument. The second aspect of things is that there is such a great deal of investment in AI procurement, development, deployment, maintenance. There are these ongoing contracts that companies maintain with technology providers, which they slide into their IT budget, right? So on the one hand, they're saying we're cutting payroll by laying people off and automating their jobs. But on the other hand, the spending that they're doing on the technology side, I'm not sure that these things are balancing out, right? At some point, things are going into the red. And everyone seems to think that if you wait and see, that those returns will come, because the AI transformation is a little bit like the internet transformation, where we started with cat videos, but now we do everything on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. I understand that. Um, can we afford, however, to make these large scale, not just financial, but social transformations without providing a safety net for those that are falling through? And I ask this question at the firm level, not at the government level. I understand that governments around the world are failing their responsibilities, but I think that firms still have some modicum of control over this. And so if they're actively reneging on their human and social impact capabilities, I'm not sure how smart they are to actually turn a profit when it comes to it. Perhaps in the short term. I'm not very hopeful for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, we saw a recent example between Claude and OpenAI. It's not about being responsible or not anymore. The economic impact, the impact to your potential reputational risk, as well as revenue generation and long-term sustainability as a corporation itself is at stake, right? So when we think about that, it's not about, okay, implementing responsible or ethical principles for the sake of it, right? And especially if you are not context or culture sensitive, you may lose customers in those geographies, right? So it's in your best interest to ensure you're inclusive of at least all your customers, if not everyone in your community. So really very powerful talking about economic impact of AI. Now, what
So,
trade-offs are policy? Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I want to follow on with that, because what's happening now, Bhuvana, I'm sure you're seeing it far more than I am, is that these questions about technosocial change and about human social impact of transformative technologies, not just AI, but all technologies that we see, these questions are now percolating upwards, right? So it's no longer that data workers in the global majority countries are being paid so little, so people are complaining. Those conversations could have been minimized, silenced, avoided until a certain point, right? They're louder now because of social media and communication technology, and thank God for that. But another thing that's starting to happen is that civic voices are being raised in places like the United States. So there are community members, lay people who may have had nothing to do with AI their entire lives, who are going up to the leadership of not just technology companies but all companies, and asking them these very pointed questions, saying, "How can you, in good moral conscience, justify the deployment of a technology that disadvantages so many people in so many different ways?" And what I'm recognizing in public forum after public forum is that the leaders of these companies have no response. They're slipping up, they just don't have the answer. And so I think because of this line of questioning, leadership across the corporate world is waking up to the fact that there is a problem. And above anything, it's currently a PR problem. And companies hate PR problems, right? Because it
Yeah,
means loss of
yeah.
revenue. So, for that reason alone, it's a bad reason, but it's an effective reason. For that reason alone, companies are now starting to wake up, and leaders in these companies are starting to say, what do I need to know to rebut these objections effectively? So, there's a kind of incidental movement around literacy and the human and social impact of AI that is now coming up. And that's the area that I work in. So fantastic, more work for me. But um, that's how I
Good
see
kind
it.
of work.
Yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, thanks for following up on that. And yeah, we have so many examples. Even recently, the social or legal victory against some of the principles that Meta had that was also impacting children. And again, we are going back to how we can empower the next generation and make the world a better place, right? But sometimes policymakers make some decisions or trade-offs in the back end that's not always visible publicly, right? So when you take innovation and regulation of how you enforce, there is always some trade-off that needs to be made, right? So what do policymakers trade off that we general public don't see always?
Yeah. So I think once again we need to take a step back, right? What is the primary role or duty of policymakers in any context? It is to ensure the well-being of the populations that they serve, right? This is why we have policy units, so we can analyze what's gone before, gather data, see what can be tweaked, see what can be done differently, and based on that either continue doing what we're doing or change course, right? So policymakers are they're the conduit to the improvement of a society and its living conditions. Now, the basic promise that most governments have reneged on over the last few years is a promise of a social safety net. And
Yeah,
that has happened for various reasons, right? In the industrialized West, it's happened because populations have grown and policy foresight has not been present. In the global majority countries, it's happened because there is now a more recent and ongoing transformation from rural to urban, from agrarian to industrialized, and from extended families, tribes, and communities into nuclear families, or even individualistic ways of living, right? So, for different reasons in different parts of the world, the social safety net is collapsing. And so, my opinion is that the primary role of policymakers is to figure out how to create it if it doesn't exist, how to strengthen it if it does exist, how to shore it up, how to update it. And that primary job has not been taken very seriously because policymakers across various countries have been far more interested in the next shiny thing, right? So,
Yeah.
and this includes Europe, which is held up as a beacon for the social safety net still holding. You can see things starting to give way in Europe also, because Europe is now coming under fire for stifling innovation because they privilege regulation, right? And it's not
Yeah.
that they privilege regulation and therefore people are better off. It's that they privilege regulation and therefore innovation doesn't happen either, right? So
Which can make better people's lives.
yes, and so in that case, I mean, I don't know what's worse, right? What's happening in Europe or what's happening in the United States, where we don't regulate innovation, not to any meaningful extent. We kind of encourage companies to go down this path of hyper capitalist extractive financialization. Um, and so what happens as a result is that some people, whoever is kind of well educated, well resourced, literate in the technologies of the time, becomes very wealthy, and everybody else gets left behind. And every few years, it's a different class of people depending on the technological progress, right? I mean, it seems like the next class of people to come up will be the defense technologists, because now we're entering a
Yeah.
period of worldwide military instability, right? What Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University calls the start of World War III. Um, so these are the people that are going to become wealthy next, right? We can already see it. How do we find a balance between innovation and regulation? Again, as I said, very large question. We're going to have to go right back to the beginning and ask ourselves, what are we regulating towards? Are we regulating towards building an economy which um, kind of ignores and sweeps aside the bottom layer, financially and economically speaking, and only privileges that at the top? Or are we regulating toward a more harmonious and sustainable society? If the answer is the former, if we're regulating so that we can build new technologies and then use them to bomb people in other countries, then there's no conflict. We're fine, right? America is doing exactly what it needs to do. Um, but the priorities, I think, need to change. I don't think that those should be our priorities.
Yeah, there should be a balance between bottom up, top down, middle out, and everywhere, right? Otherwise, we'll be doing something, advancing something that's not going to actually benefit the real people who are on the ground all the time.
Yeah.
You earlier also alluded to the responsibility of leaders and the leadership function, right? So, when it comes to having responsible AI implemented more useful to the local communities or within their customers and stakeholders, it's more a leadership function. And if an organization wants to move from high level AI ethics principles to real implementation, if you are a leader, what are the first two changes you will make internally in your organization?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think if I find myself in a leadership position of any kind of organization in today's day and age, the first thing I would do is very frantically upskill and try and
Mm,
understand what the role of AI is in a larger context, right? And so perhaps um, hear everything I've said for the last 40 minutes and kind of play it over and over again so you get a broader sweep of things, right? And I'll say this without any false modesty. I think these are important things to be understood for leaders. The
mm,
next thing I would do is I would really shy away from any technology leaders in my organization that are deterministic in terms of if we don't use the technology, we'll fall behind. Rather, I would take a moment to assess whether we're replacing humans with automation for the right reasons. And the right reasons may be we're doing things better, we're doing things more efficiently, we're making less mistakes, we're increasing our level of customer and client satisfaction, or stakeholder satisfaction if this is a nonprofit organization. And the other thing I would do is I would encourage a much more broad general usage and understanding of AI across my organization. So it might
mm,
be that the people in my organization that need AI the most are the people at the operations level. and perhaps not the
Yeah.
people at the customer facing or human facing level. So I'd make those distinctions very, very carefully. I don't think that's being done. I think what's happening is everyone is kind of experiencing fear of missing out and just deploying AI because everyone else is doing it. And that's certainly not the way to go.
And most of it these days lands on the engineering team, expecting them to be implementing and defining some of this, when ideally, like you mentioned, it should be more a top down as well as a bottom up, but also operationally feasible and accountable. Now, when we talk about accountability, let's say within an organization or within a policy institution or anywhere else geographically in a country or a community, when we say we need to ensure accountability is measured, how do you measure it? I mean, how do I know beyond just the qualitative signals that it's working and I'm doing the right thing? Or if it's not working, I know how quantitatively I need to adjust so that I can be back on track.
God, that feels like a very technical question. Can you give me a context to think about?
Yeah, definitely. So, as a leader, we spoke about a couple of changes that you will make in an organization to see where we get started to enter this transformation, right? So, once you have put in these transformation, let's say policies or frameworks in place, how do you know it's working? How do you measure it? Is there a quantitative way, or is it more like qualitative, where your customers, stakeholders, or the market is telling you that you are a good company, good brand?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's always both, right? So, um, qualitative outcomes are also reflected in data.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and so there's no, I mean, customer satisfaction shows up in your revenues, in your sales, in your new business development, in your acquisitions, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and if your stakeholders are unhappy, that shows up also in terms of donor funds being withdrawn or support being withdrawn or um, organizations being placed under scrutiny, et cetera, et cetera. I think as a basic principle, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing better than before, then you're doing fine. Right now, how you measure that in your particular context will vary greatly. What does it mean for a school or university as opposed to a soap factory, as opposed to an airline, as opposed to a hospital, as opposed to a government agency? Those are very different things, right? Um, but if you're doing what you set out to do better, if you're meeting your mission better, cheaper, faster, more effectively, more sustainably, um, that's your accountability, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. Because however varied the implementation or the industry or your mission and organization looks like, as long as you have a way to measure it and continuously keep track to iterate and improve, that's all that matters, right? So, iteratively progressing on the goals. Now, when we talk about ethics, it's not universally defined. We spoke about so many different variations, even within same sectors and industries, right? So, keeping ethics as something that's grounded, how do you think cultural context influences how responsible AI is interpreted and applied across different regions, sectors, or AI systems? I mean, just help me understand the context between these two.
Yeah, sure. So it's a good moment to be asking this question because on April 10th, which was less than 2 weeks ago, China produced its interim laws on human like AI interaction, right? Um,
Mm,
China is a country and a culture that takes a collectivist view. So there are many problems with this approach, right? First of all, it's quite clearly non-democratic. Secondly, it lends itself well to authoritarianism. Third, we've seen quite prominent instances of large-scale organized human rights violations. So for all these reasons, I preface what I'm going to say by the fact that there are problems in every culture, and China is one of these cultures. However, they do have a collectivist approach to social good and social sustainability. So, one of the things that they've recognized is it doesn't matter whether AI is human or not. The fact that it's human like and the fact that it's It's capable of displaying behavior and causing outcomes that may be damaging to people, to humans. It needs to be governed. And so these interim laws were introduced on April 10th, as I said, and they're going to go into effect on July 15th. So we're in this interim period of the interim laws where we have the opportunity to take a nice look at them. And it's really quite delicious seeing what they've come up with, right? There is a wide-ranging and forward-looking approach where policymakers in China are saying, this is a technology that can trick people into thinking that it's human. And therefore, it can do a
Yeah.
lot of social and psychological damage. So how do we safeguard against that? Who do we hold liable? How do we protect our populations while ensuring that the technology continues to develop? And China is now no fading wallflower. It's competing very aggressively against the United States in the development of this technology. So that's one interesting approach to look at it, right? But again, as you said at the beginning of your question, cultures are so different. And so what are we doing in the United States? We're saying, okay, so there shouldn't be racial bias, for instance, built into AI, because one of the founding principles of this iteration of the modern United States is that there should be racial equality. That doesn't actually work out because you're focusing your lens on a technical part of a larger social problem, which is that there is racial inequality and lack of social justice in the United States.
With
Right?
or without technology. Yeah.
Right. So can you blame the tech companies for perpetuating something that already exists? Perhaps you can. Perhaps you can hold them accountable to some extent. But at the same time, you have to be working very hard to smooth out the racial balance and put everyone at par with each other, give everyone the same systemic advantages so that people can be equal regardless of racial heritage. We're doing the opposite in the United States. We're taking away DEI. We're taking away affirmative action. We're telling people they are now equal without leveling the playing field for them. So in an environment like this, where this is our culture in the United States, um, how are we going to regulate a technology that perpetuates racial bias? It's not possible, right?
Yeah. It's a very difficult conversation to have. And if we are talking about just US, China, then when we talk about every other country in the world, the problem only, multiplies. And for a lighter moment, I also saw something about a marathon that was being run on the same uh, street between robots and humans running parallel to each other. And we could see how human resilience still is at the top, regardless of however we try to configure the machine. So really, it's not about trying to, take over human lives. Rather, we should see how we can integrate human intelligence to use artificial intelligence for the benefit of humanity rather than other way around trying to replace or see where we can take over.
Yeah,
Now
and
looking
I
ahead,
just, I just want to add to that. Sorry to interrupt you.
sure,
I,
please.
I taught about this in my class just this week, actually. So it's this example of the robot marathon is fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
What's very interesting is, when a robot wins a marathon, the only thing it really means is that the robot won the marathon. Um, I think there's this false kind of contrast being set up between humans and machines, right? Now, machines can do this better than humans and they can do that better than humans. And, that's fantastic. I mean, I'm not going to, as a human, I'm not going to suddenly turn into a car and be able to put four people on my back and zoom through the streets, right? I'm human. I'm not a car. So that's kind of a false, it's a false dichotomy that's being set up. That's one thing. The other thing is, I read an interesting commentary from an American commentator who was calling this the Sputnik moment for American
Hmm.
technology. And that is so indicative of the American mindset at this point, right? It's that there is a race towards technological dominance, which at all points America has to win. Which, I love the competitive spirit. That's why I'm here in this country, benefiting from its resources. Um, And that's fantastic, right? There's a very committed culture of scientific and technological understanding with a view towards dominance. I enjoy being part of this culture. However, to set up these false oppositions once again, saying, oh, this is a country or a society that is basically an enemy, and so if they're doing something, we need to be doing it better, and we're not, they're doing it better, so that's a problem, right? The focus of this paranoia is entirely misplaced. It's not, are we using the technology that we also have to do good things for our country, for our society? That's not the focus. The focus is a very single minded, do we have it? Can we build it? Can we perhaps go to war with it or about it, as opposed to, can we use it effectively? That's not the conversation that's happening.
Yeah, for the benefit of our own people, right? So everything comes down to a societal safety net, like you mentioned earlier, especially relying on the next generation. And we are also kind of coming up time. I want to check in with you one last time. Looking ahead, what concerns you more? Weak implementation of responsible AI or misalignment in how it is defined across institutions, regardless of the type of institution? And why do you think so? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, so I think above both of these considerations that you mentioned is a consideration of literacy, inclusion, and participation, right? I
Mm,
don't think enough people around the world understand what AI is. They may understand how to use a large language model to generate prose or graphics or ideas or create deepfake videos, but that's a very superficial understanding. There's no real widespread global understanding of what AI is and how it can help us, how it can be truly transformational. And perhaps that's because this is still early days, right? So the fields,
mm.
for instance, neurosurgery, bioengineering, chemical manufacturing, et cetera, these fields are now figuring out how to deploy AI to advance the fields. But as a general global literacy, we're really still quite lacking. And so until we don't get to a point where more people understand what AI is and what it can do, we're not really going to be cultivating the benefits on a mass scale. What's going to continue to happen is those of us who understand the technology are going to become wealthier as a result, um, because we're exploiting these economies of information, right? And the rest of us will, as usual, continue to be left behind. Now, the problem with AI is with each iteration of new technology, each cycle of technological progress, technologies become faster, they become stronger, they become more global in their reach, and they can be amplified. Every pre-existing problem can be amplified very, very quickly with the help of these technologies. So, for instance, it took 70 years for everyone in the United States to buy a television set, and it
Yeah.
took maybe 2 months for almost everyone of a certain population to sign on to an LLM subscription. So
Yeah.
the pace
Chat
of
GPT.
change, it's amazing, right? The pace of change is just
Yeah.
astronomical. So while the basic phenomena is the same, the urgency with which it needs to be addressed is really quite different. And so the conversation on literacy and inclusion needs to happen far faster than it's happening now. That's my opinion.
No, perfectly well said, and a good closing argument, and hope and optimism for people trying to get ahead with this technology, learn this technology, and also focusing more on inclusion and participation, like you mentioned, beyond just getting ahead as one sector or one country.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts for our audience? How can people get in touch with you?
Well, people can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me on most of the social media channels. Very happy to connect and talk with both individuals and groups who are interested in my ideas. But I do think that when we have these conversations on responsible AI, especially because women sort of have a social license to talk about things other than business, right? That's still the world we live in. that I think
Yeah.
more of us should be talking about AI in a much broader context and kind of get out of these profit making corporation scenarios where there's enough people figuring that out, right? I think there's lots of other work to be done, and that's where we could be effective.
Yeah, and that's where more participation from diverse communities is really important in this conversation. Thanks again, Manail, for taking time to join us. Thanks everyone for spending your time with us today. I appreciate the thoughtful perspectives shared by Manail. If you'd like to continue the discussion, please feel free to connect with her, connect with me on LinkedIn. We are always happy to engage offline, respond to questions. If you have suggestions on any future topics or voices, do let us know. I host these Women in AI conversations once a month, bringing together global experts on ethical AI, culture, policy, and leadership. Please keep an eye out for our next month's topic and guest, and do sign up when registrations open up. Thank you again for joining us and for being part of this global dialogue. Thanks again, Manil, for taking time to talk to us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.